Long before it became the Kristen Stewart scandal that provoked Donald Trump, it was a single photograph that pulverized a billion-dollar fairy tale. In one blinding flash, 3 names were permanently bound in Hollywood infamy: Kristen Stewart, Robert Pattinson, and Rupert Sanders. When 22-year-old Stewart was caught in an illicit embrace with her 41-year-old married director, the public reaction exposed a ruthless double standard. Sanders, the authority figure who shattered his own family vows, was granted a quiet escape into the shadows. Meanwhile, Stewart was thrown to the wolves, dragged into a brutal global arena, and branded a wicked homewrecker. Why does society so eagerly crucify a young woman for breaking an illusion while completely absolving the married man standing right beside her? The year was 2008 when a modest vampire romance mutated into a global obsession. The Twilight Saga hijacked an entire generation, and at its epicenter were Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson. When their undeniable on-screen chemistry blossomed into a real-life romance, they became a highly monetized commodity. But living inside a glass cage carried a crushing psychological weight for both of them. Pattinson, a naturally introverted British actor, was not just deeply uncomfortable with the manic intrusion of the paparazzi. He was suffocating under the immense pressure of playing the flawless, immortal protector. He was forced into the archetype of the perfect boyfriend, an impossible standard no human could maintain. Meanwhile, Stewart, fiercely independent, felt equally trapped by the sanitized, sparkling romance she was forced to perform daily. They were 2 young actors united by a shared claustrophobic nightmare, desperate for an escape from their own manufactured perfection. By late 2011, the urge to shatter her own pristine image pushed Stewart toward a drastically different creative landscape. She signed on to lead Snow White and the Huntsman, a dark, violent, big-budget reimagining of the classic fairy tale. This was her calculated escape route. She was desperate to prove her artistic depth, to shed the glittering skin of a teenage idol, and to be taken seriously by an industry that had largely reduced her to a franchise mascot. She wanted to bleed for a role, to get dirty in the mud of a grueling production, completely shattering the manufactured teenage dream that had made her a global obsession. Sitting in the director's chair was Rupert Sanders. Born in London in 1971, Sanders was an accomplished commercial director making his highly anticipated feature film debut. At 40 years old, he was nearly 2 decades Stewart's senior. He possessed an air of mature, European sophistication, heavily grounded by his long-standing marriage to British model Liberty Ross, and his role as a father to 2 young children. Sanders operated in a completely different stratosphere from the manic, teenage-driven ecosystem that Stewart and Pattinson inhabited. To a young woman suffocating under the weight of Hollywood's manufactured youth, a 40-year-old married director offered an intoxicating illusion of grounded adult reality. The environment on a massive movie set is inherently insular. For months on end, actors and directors are isolated in a hyper-focused creative bubble, enduring grueling hours in remote locations, entirely removed from the stabilizing anchors of their real lives. Within this high-pressure vacuum, a deeply uneven power dynamic took root. Sanders was the absolute authority figure on set, the man hired to guide Stewart through her most physically and emotionally demanding role to date. She was the vulnerable artist searching for validation and direction from an older, established professional. He held the power of the camera. She carried the massive financial weight of the film's box office potential. As the production dragged on, the strict professional boundaries that protect young actors on set began to erode. Whispers of a highly inappropriate closeness between the young star and her older director started to circulate among the crew. What began as intense creative collaboration slowly mutated into a dangerous personal transgression. Sanders was a man old enough to fully comprehend the profound moral responsibility he held, not just to his wife and children waiting at home, but to the 21-year-old woman trusting him to direct her performance. He was the adult in the room, the figure of authority who should have maintained the boundary. Yet the heavy, isolating atmosphere of the production became a breeding ground for crossed lines. The studio fixers, tasked with protecting their multi-million-dollar investment, swiftly moved to suppress the rumors leaking from the heavily guarded sound stages. The machinery of Hollywood requires its leading ladies to remain flawless, and any hint of an illicit affair threatened to derail the marketing campaign of a massive blockbuster. They managed to keep the whispers confined to the shadows, allowing the film to wrap and head into post-production without a public scandal. But behind the heavy curtains of the studio system, the Golden Girl of Hollywood had wandered into incredibly destructive territory, guided by a man who was actively dismantling his own family vows. The spark ignited on that dark fairy tale set was no longer just an industry rumor, it was a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate in the unforgiving glare of the California sun. The summer of 2012 marked a terrifying evolution in the mechanics of celebrity surveillance, creating an environment where no human secret could survive the brutal efficiency of the paparazzi apparatus. Los Angeles was not merely a city, it was a militarized zone for tabloid journalism. Photographers no longer relied on luck or waiting outside popular nightclubs. They operated as highly funded rogue intelligence networks. They utilized informants within restaurants, paid off valets, tracked license plates, and deployed long-range telephoto lenses originally designed for wildlife photography, capable of capturing the microscopic details of human intimacy from extraordinary distances. The bounty on the stars of the Twilight franchise was astronomical. A single exclusive photograph of Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson could fund a photographer's entire year. But a photograph proving the destruction of that very romance? That was a holy grail, a piece of visual currency that carried a multi-million-dollar price tag. Resisting the bulletproof SUVs of her peers, Kristen Stewart navigated Los Angeles in a modest, dark-colored Mini Cooper, a desperate attempt to find a sliver of invisibility. But she was a globally hunted commodity. On a blisteringly hot Tuesday afternoon in July, a veteran photographer tracked that Mini Cooper to a dusty stretch of the Hollywood Hills. Through a massive telephoto lens, what he captured was not cinematic romance. It was clumsy, desperate, and agonizingly real. The photographs showed Stewart leaning against the steering wheel of the small car, and later standing awkwardly outside the vehicle on the dusty shoulder of the road. Hovering over her, pulling her into a tight, undeniable embrace, was her director, Rupert Sanders. The visual language of these images guaranteed absolute devastation. They were not blurry, ambiguous shapes taken in the dead of night. They were brightly lit, high-resolution documentations of betrayal, captured in the stark, unforgiving afternoon sun. Stewart was dressed in her trademark scruffy attire, a worn t-shirt, a backward baseball cap, her posture defensive and guarded. She looked exactly like the 22-year-old girl she was, stripped entirely of the manufactured glamour of Bella Swan. Beside her, Rupert Sanders occupied the frame with the heavy, undeniable weight of a man deeply comfortable in his own authority. He was the established authority figure who had just guided her through the most grueling physical production of her career. The visual imbalance of power was glaring. In one particularly devastating frame, he is seen pressing his face against her shoulder, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist, kissing the back of her neck as they lean against a concrete railing overlooking the sprawling, indifferent city. It was a deeply intimate, aggressively possessive gesture. The images did not merely suggest an affair, they served as a brutal, empirical autopsy of a billion-dollar fairy tale. For years, the studio system had aggressively, relentlessly sold the public an image of Kristen Stewart as the fiercely loyal, eternally devoted partner to Robert Pattinson. Every red carpet appearance, every carefully curated magazine cover, every heavily monitored television interview had reinforced the narrative of an unbreakable, perfect love. The public had been conditioned to view her exclusively through the lens of unwavering fidelity. Now, frozen in the grainy texture of paparazzi film, was the stark, undeniable reality of human contradiction. The images captured a young woman actively tearing down the walls of her own suffocating, manufactured existence, caught in the arms of an older man who was actively, consciously dismantling his own family vows. When the editors at Us Weekly magazine acquired the memory cards containing these photographs, the atmosphere in their boardroom was likely one of profound, calculated elation. They recognized immediately that they were holding the most destructive piece of pop culture currency of the decade. This was not a rumor to be buried in the back pages. It was a nuclear weapon ready to be dropped directly onto the global entertainment landscape. The editorial decision was instantaneous and ruthless. They bypassed the standard gossip columns and dedicated the entire cover of their upcoming issue to the scandal. The layout was designed for maximum psychological impact. It featured the most damning, inescapable photograph of the embrace, accompanied by a massive, glaring yellow headline that screamed the ultimate betrayal to anyone walking past a supermarket checkout line. But the true world-shattering devastation of this event was not contained within the glossy printed pages of a physical magazine. The July 2012 scandal arrived at the exact historical moment when the traditional print tabloid violently collided with the raw, unfiltered, and terrifying speed of modern social media. This collision fundamentally altered the physics of public relations crisis management. As the physical magazines were being loaded onto delivery trucks, the digital images were simultaneously unleashed onto platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and emerging blog networks. Previous Hollywood scandals, even those involving monumental betrayals, had taken days or weeks to fully permeate the cultural consciousness, filtered slowly through evening television broadcasts and printed weekly columns. This scandal, however, detonated instantly across millions of glowing screens worldwide. It was a real-time, global meltdown facilitated by algorithms designed to maximize outrage. Within minutes of the digital publication, the photographs had gone completely viral, hijacking the internet's trending topics and forcing themselves into the feeds of every person with a smartphone, regardless of whether they cared about celebrity news. The psychological shockwave that hit the global Twilight fandom was unprecedented. For millions, the romance between Stewart and Pattinson was vital proof that the perfect love from Stephenie Meyer's novels existed in a cynical world. To see that illusion shattered caused a collective psychological break. The internet flooded with raw videos of fans weeping hysterically into webcams, violently tearing down posters, and burning movie tickets in backyard fire pits. This agony quickly metastasized into a bloodthirsty vengeance directed entirely at the young woman who broke the spell. Bella Swan was dead, and the public demanded blood. The digital stage was set for a highly public shaming that would redefine the cruelty of the internet age. It unleashed a torrent of fury that pushed a young woman to the edge of endurance, while the man who had held her quietly stepped back into the shadows. The immediate aftermath of the photographic detonation created an asphyxiating vacuum within the heavily fortified boardrooms of Hollywood. Behind closed doors, the crisis management machinery of a billion-dollar franchise was thrown into sheer, unadulterated panic. The final installment of the Twilight saga was scheduled for a massive global theatrical release in just a few months. The entire marketing campaign, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was intrinsically anchored to the real-life romance of its two lead actors. Now, the studio executives were staring at a catastrophic financial and public relations implosion. The pristine, highly lucrative illusion they had meticulously engineered was bleeding out on the front page of every tabloid on Earth. In the brutally pragmatic world of the studio system, Kristen Stewart immediately transformed from their most valuable asset into their most dangerous liability. The pressure exerted upon the 22-year-old actress during those agonizing first 24 hours is almost impossible to quantify. She was entirely isolated, trapped within the sprawling confines of a Los Angeles estate, while a fleet of paparazzi helicopters violently circled the airspace above her roof. The noise of the rotors physically shook the windows, a constant deafening reminder that the entire world was waiting for her to break. Inside that house, she She was surrounded by high-powered publicists, lawyers, and crisis fixers, individuals whose primary objective was not to protect her mental well-being, but to mitigate the financial hemorrhage of the impending film release. The traditional Hollywood protocol for a scandal of this magnitude dictates a prolonged, strategic silence. The standard playbook requires the offending party to retreat entirely, issue a vague, sterile statement requesting privacy through a legal representative, and wait for the digital firestorm to run out of oxygen. Kristen Stewart, however, did not follow the established protocol, whether driven by the sheer, unadulterated panic of a young woman watching her life disintegrate, or pressured by a studio desperate to salvage the upcoming press tour. She broke the silence. Less than 24 hours after the photographs hit the internet, a public statement was released to the global media. It remains one of the most agonizing, humiliating, and raw public apologies in the history of modern celebrity culture. It completely abandoned the sanitized, corporate vernacular typical of Hollywood crisis management. It did not ask for space. It did not offer vague excuses about the pressures of fame or the complexities of a working environment. It was a direct, unfiltered transmission of total emotional collapse. I'm deeply sorry for the hurt and embarrassment I've caused to those close to me and everyone this has affected, the statement read. This momentary indiscretion has jeopardized the most important thing in my life, the person I love and respect the most, Rob. I love him. I love him. I'm so sorry. The repetition at the end of that statement, I love him, is a haunting piece of text. It does not read like a press release drafted by a team of highly paid publicists in a Century City boardroom. It reads exactly like a frantic, desperate text message sent from a broken 22-year-old girl to a lover she knows she has just lost forever. It possessed a terrified, breathless vulnerability. In that singular moment, Kristen Stewart entirely stripped away the protective armor of her global celebrity. She laid her deepest, most humiliating private pain bare upon the altar of global public opinion, offering the world an unguarded look at her own devastation. In a compassionate society, such a raw display of human vulnerability might have elicited a degree of empathy. It might have reminded the public that behind the glittering facade of the highest paid actress in the world was simply a young, profoundly flawed human being buckling under unimaginable pressure. But the internet of 2012 was not a compassionate arena. It was an unforgiving space driven by outrage, and the public was demanding a villain. Instead of extinguishing the flames, the apology acted as a highly combustible accelerant. By publicly claiming ownership of the betrayal, Stewart provided the digital mob with the irrefutable ammunition needed for a flawless public crucifixion. The media instantly weaponized her words, broadcasting the phrase momentary indiscretion on continuous loops across every major television network. The ensuing vitriol possessed a specifically vicious, deeply misogynistic flavor. The internet stripped her of her achievements and reduced her to degrading caricatures. A tramp, a traitor, a ruined woman who had thrown away the ultimate prize. The mob did not hate her simply because she cheated. They hated her because she broke the spell. She dragged millions back to Earth, forcing them to confront the reality that perfection is a manufactured lie. The relentless insults were mechanisms of control, designed to punish her for her defiance and serve as a brutal warning to any young woman who dared to step out of her assigned narrative cage. The psychological isolation of this experience is staggering to contemplate. Stewart was locked inside a sprawling mansion, entirely cut off from the outside world, watching through glowing screens as an entire planet collectively agreed to despise her. She could not defend herself. She could not explain the suffocating pressure of her life, the confusing power dynamics of the film set, or the complex, messy reality of her failing relationship. The digital mob mob had already passed the sentence, and the punishment was absolute, total public humiliation. The entire crisis had effectively transformed the deep, private agony of three human beings into a highly lucrative spectator sport, locking them into rigid media-assigned archetypes: the witch, the saint, and the ghost. While Stewart was burned alive on the digital pyre as the wicked temptress, Robert Pattinson was thrust into a completely different, yet equally suffocating narrative cage. The media instantly cast him as the tragic, deeply wounded martyr. Paparazzi tracked his every movement like a state funeral. This environment of aggressive, global pity stripped Pattinson of his privacy, forcing him to navigate his genuine heartbreak under the humiliating scrutiny of millions. The public actively weaponized their sympathy for him, turning the young actor into the patron saint of the brokenhearted, a symbol used continually to justify their relentless assault on Stewart. But the most terrifying optical illusion of this trio's dynamic was taking place just outside the frame. While the mob weaponized Pattinson's heartbreak to crucify Stewart, Rupert Sanders performed one of the most astonishing disappearing acts in modern pop culture. He was the architect of the betrayal, the older man wielding absolute power on set, a husband and father. Yet in the frenzied arithmetic of tabloid justice, he became the ghost. The public and the media were so violently consumed by the destruction of the teen romance that they completely erased the 41-year-old man from his own scandal, granting him a quiet, seamless escape into the shadows, while the two young actors bore the absolute entirety of the global fallout. The breathtaking asymmetry of the public outrage laid bare a deeply ingrained, structurally misogynistic bias governing the entertainment industry and society at large. Here was a 41-year-old man, an established British director who had been handed the reins of a massive studio blockbuster. He possessed the maturity, the life experience, and the professional authority to maintain a strict, unyielding boundary with his young, heavily scrutinized lead actress. By every logical moral metric, his transgression carried a far heavier weight of ethical failure. He did not just break a romance, he fractured a marriage and a family unit. Yet, the media apparatus did not brand Rupert Sanders with a scarlet letter. They did not launch a global inquisition into his character flaws. The tabloids did not dedicate countless front pages to psychoanalyzing his motives, nor did the public record themselves weeping hysterically over his ethical shortcomings. Instead, he was granted the ultimate unearned luxury of the patriarchal establishment. He was treated as a passive, almost helpless participant in his own life. The narrative constructed around Sanders was deeply insidious in its softness. The media softly reframed the narrative to suggest that he had simply stumbled off the path, a man who had momentarily lost his bearings in the blinding glare of Hollywood. The language used by the press completely stripped him of his agency. He was not framed as a man who made a conscious daily decision to pursue his young star. Rather, he was subtly painted as a victim of a powerful, intoxicating temptation. To justify this narrative, the media had to aggressively rebrand Kristen Stewart. They could no longer present her as the awkward, fiercely independent indie darling who hated the red carpet. They needed a villain capable of overpowering a 41-year-old man. Overnight, the 22-year-old girl in denim and Converse sneakers was transformed into a dark, hypnotic siren. The tabloids projected a predatory, highly manipulative aura onto her, utilizing the oldest, most venomous archetype in the historical playbook, the wicked temptress. The narrative actively suggested that her youth, her fame, and her undeniable magnetism were weapons she had calculatingly deployed to derail a helpless family man. It is a chilling testament to the power of media manipulation. A young woman, appearing completely unguarded, was successfully spun into a malevolent force of nature. Meanwhile, the man actively holding her was simply painted as collateral damage. This aggressive framing allowed Sanders' high-powered public public relations team to execute a masterclass in crisis deflection. While Stewart was bleeding out in the public square, her desperate apology analyzed word by word on every television network. Sanders issued a statement that was brief, sterile, and entirely focused on his domestic sphere. He expressed profound sorrow for the pain caused to his beautiful wife and heavenly children, praying they could survive this together. The statement was a brilliantly calculated shield. By immediately hiding behind the bodies of his wife and children, he effectively shut down the conversation regarding his professional misconduct. Instead of addressing his professional misconduct or acknowledging the profound power imbalance on set, he offered zero apologies to the public, the fans, or the young woman enduring a global crucifixion for a fire they had ignited together. He simply issued his quiet mea culpa and vanished, retreating into the impenetrable fortress of male privilege. The studio did not suspend him. The Directors Guild did not launch an investigation. The industry quietly, efficiently closed ranks around him, protecting the establishment and allowing the young woman to bear the absolute entirety of the consequences. The sheer volume of hatred directed at Stewart, left entirely alone on the digital stage, quickly escalated from tabloid gossip into a bizarre, high-stakes form of cultural bullying. The controversy bled beyond the boundaries of entertainment news and infected the broader cultural discourse. It became a socially acceptable blood sport to hurl abuse at the actress, a phenomenon that reached its absolute surreal zenith when the highest echelons of power actively joined the digital mob. In an unprecedented display of public harassment, a powerful real estate billionaire, years before his eventual political ascent, developed a strange, relentless obsession with the scandal. From the luxurious confines of his penthouse, this man in his late 60s utilized his massive Twitter platform to launch a series of vicious, unprovoked attacks against the 22-year-old actress. He did not simply comment on the news, he actively demanded that Robert Pattinson abandon her. He tweeted repeatedly, warning the young actor that she had cheated on him like a dog and would undoubtedly do it again. He publicly invited Pattinson to attend events, aggressively positioning himself as a guardian of male pride while simultaneously utilizing his vast influence to humiliate a young woman navigating the darkest moment of her life. This barrage of tweets was not a random, isolated incident. It was a stark, chilling, physical manifestation of society's deep-seated desire to discipline women who step out of line. Here was a man of immense wealth and power, a figurehead of the patriarchal establishment, feeling absolutely entitled to publicly police the romantic life of a young woman he had never met. He was utilizing his digital megaphone to ensure that the punishment was severe, permanent, and maximally degrading. And the most terrifying aspect of this billionaire's intervention was not the tweets themselves, but the public reaction to them. The internet did not condemn a powerful man in his 60s for harassing a young girl in her 20s over a private breakup. Instead, a massive segment of the population cheered him on. They retweeted his insults, amplified his demands, and validated his cruelty. It proved that the public was not merely interested in justice. They were ravenous for an execution, completely indifferent to the identity of the executioner, as long as the blade fell sharply upon the designated witch. Within this toxic ecosystem, the media actively searched for more weapons to use against Stewart. They found a highly potent, deeply tragic prop in Liberty Ross, the wife of Rupert Sanders. Ross, a stunning, successful British model, was navigating the unimaginable, deeply private agony of discovering her husband's infidelity on the front cover of a global magazine. Her pain was undeniable, her humiliation absolute, yet the tabloid industry did not treat her with genuine empathy or respect. effect. They weaponized her trauma, transforming her into a tragic, silent martyr specifically designed to inflict maximum psychological damage upon Stewart. Week after week, the magazines ran side-by-side comparative spreads. On one side, they would publish photographs of Ross looking dignified, sorrowful, and entirely devastated, heavily emphasizing her role as a devoted mother whose sanctuary had been destroyed. Directly beside her, they would place images of Stewart, deliberately selecting photographs where she looked sullen, unsmiling, or defiant. The headlines were designed to pit the two women against each other in a brutal, non-consensual gladiator match. The heartbroken wife versus the ruthless homewrecker. The innocent mother versus the selfish Hollywood brat. This relentless juxtaposition was a form of psychological warfare. It intentionally stripped both women of their fundamental humanity, reducing their complex, agonizing realities into flat, oppositional archetypes. The media forced the public to constantly evaluate, judge, and rank the worth of these two women based entirely on their relationship to the betrayal of one man. They used the genuine tears of a betrayed wife to further stoke the flames burning the young actress, all while entirely ignoring the man who had actually broken the marriage vows. Sanders was treated as a passive prize that had been stolen from the rightful owner, completely absolved of his own agency in the destruction of his home. It was a masterclass in patriarchal misdirection, ensuring that the women bore the entirety of the emotional and reputational cost while the man remained untouched by the venom. The profound, enduring tragedy of this specific cultural moment lies in what it revealed about the collective psyche of the era. The furious, unyielding backlash against Kristen Stewart was not strictly about the act of infidelity. Hollywood is an industry built upon affairs, broken marriages, and scandalous betrayals. History is littered with beloved actors who have committed far worse offenses and faced merely a fraction of the outrage. The specific, lethal nature of the hatred directed at Stewart was rooted in a much deeper, more insidious societal grievance. Kristen Stewart was punished with such breathtaking severity because she committed the ultimate crime against the public. She was ungrateful for the fantasy she had been assigned. Society had handed her the ultimate, highly coveted prize. She was granted the billionaire franchise, the unprecedented wealth, and the flawlessly handsome leading man. She was positioned as the luckiest girl in the world, the living embodiment of a fairy tale that millions of people desperately wished to inhabit. The public demand was simple. She was required to remain eternally grateful, docile, and perfectly aligned with the pristine image of Bella Swan. When she engaged in that illicit embrace on the side of a dusty road, she did not just break Robert Pattinson's heart. She violently rejected the script society had written for her. She proved that she was not the perfect, submissive princess, but a chaotic, deeply flawed, sexually autonomous young woman capable of immense destruction. Society possesses a terrifying, visceral hatred for women who refuse to be obedient to the narratives assigned to them. The digital mob wanted to break her because she had the audacity to throw away the exact life they were dreaming of. The relentless insults, the paparazzi harassment, and the public shaming were all mechanisms of control, designed to punish her for her defiance, and to serve as a brutal warning to any other young woman who might dare to step out of the gilded cage. For months, the storm raged with an intensity that threatened to completely consume her existence. Stewart was trapped in a state of suspended animation, a pariah in her own industry, forced to walk through a world that openly despised her. The golden illusion of the Twilight Empire was entirely pulverized, leaving behind a bitter, undeniable reality. The world had witnessed a breathtaking display of societal hypocrisy, a prolonged, highly profitable exercise in public shaming that exposed the terrifying double standards of a culture that demands absolute perfection from its young women, while offering an endless, quiet absolution to its men. The smoke from the scandal scandal hung heavily over Los Angeles, obscuring the future, leaving the broken pieces of 3 lives scattered across the digital landscape, waiting for a reckoning that the media apparatus was desperately trying to avoid. As the digital execution of Kristen Stewart reached a fever pitch, the physical reality of the devastation began to materialize in the quiet, heavily guarded enclaves of Los Angeles. The golden illusion had been shattered in the virtual realm, but the actual, tangible dismantling of the lives involved was a slow, agonizing process executed under the relentless gaze of a predatory media. The sanctuary that Stewart and Robert Pattinson had desperately tried to build, a private fortress shielded from the manic obsession of the Twilight fandom, was violently breached. The gates of their shared Los Angeles estate, once a symbol of their impenetrable bond, became the staging ground for a grim, highly publicized funeral of a romance. In the weeks following the publication of the photographs, the paparazzi established a permanent, aggressive encampment outside the property. They were waiting for the inevitable visual confirmation of the collapse. When the moving trucks finally arrived, they were greeted by a blinding barrage of camera flashes. The media treated the logistics of a breakup as a monumental historical event. Helicopters hovered at low altitudes, their telephoto lenses trained on the driveway, desperate to capture a glimpse of Pattinson packing his belongings. The footage of cardboard boxes being loaded into the back of transport vehicles was broadcast on international television networks, accompanied by somber, dramatic commentary. It was a grotesque invasion of human privacy, transforming the deeply painful, profoundly isolating experience of a young man leaving the woman he loved into a globally syndicated reality television episode. Pattinson's retreat was characterized by a profound, dignified silence. The tabloids were desperate for a reaction, offering staggering sums of money for an exclusive interview, hoping to goad him into a public condemnation of Stewart. They wanted anger, they wanted vengeance, they wanted the male lead to deliver the final fatal blow to the ruined actress. But Pattinson refused to participate in the blood sport. He retreated into the homes of close friends, shielding himself from the relentless circus. When he was finally forced to emerge to fulfill contractual promotional duties for an upcoming film, his demeanor was quiet, guarded, and incredibly weary. He deflected invasive questions with a polite, impenetrable deflection, denying the media the dramatic sound bites they craved. His refusal to publicly destroy Stewart was a quiet act of grace in an environment completely devoid of it, but it did nothing to quell the public's insatiable appetite for her punishment. While the private separation was agonizing, the true psychological horror of the aftermath lay in the corporate obligations of the Hollywood studio system. The scandal had detonated in the summer of 2012, just months before the scheduled global premiere of the Twilight saga, Breaking Dawn, Part 2. The studio executives facing the potential derailment of a billion-dollar franchise finale were entirely paralyzed by panic. They had invested astronomical sums into a marketing campaign built exclusively on the epic, undying romance of Bella and Edward. Now they were tasked with selling a fantasy of eternal love using 2 actors whose real-life relationship had just exploded in the most public, humiliating manner conceivable. The studio made a ruthless, pragmatic decision. The multi-million-dollar machinery could not be halted for the sake of human heartbreak. Stewart and Pattinson were contractually obligated to complete the global press tour, forcing them to stand side by side on international red carpets, smiling for the same media apparatus that had just spent months tearing them apart. The November premiere of Breaking Dawn, Part 2 in Los Angeles, was not a celebration of a cinematic milestone. It was a high-stakes psychological psychological thriller masquerading as a Hollywood event. The atmosphere outside the Nokia Theater was suffocatingly tense. Thousands of fans had camped out for days, creating a chaotic, unpredictable sea of screaming faces. The public relations teams had spent weeks choreographing every single movement, terrified of an unscripted moment or a hostile reaction from the crowd. When Kristen Stewart stepped onto the black carpet, the flashbulbs erupted with a blinding, violent intensity. She was dressed in a sheer, nude-colored lace gown, projecting an image of hardened, impenetrable glamour. But beneath the heavy makeup and the tailored couture, the physical toll of the preceding months was undeniably evident. Her movements were rigid, her smile geometrically forced, lacking the effortless, awkward charm that had defined her earlier years. She was a young woman walking into a firing squad, entirely aware that every micro-expression, every shift in her weight, and every glance she directed toward Pattinson would be instantly analyzed, dissected, and judged by millions of people across the globe. The dynamic between Stewart and Pattinson on that carpet was agonizing to witness. They were positioned together for the mandatory cast photographs, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a massive wall of screaming photographers. The physical proximity, once entirely natural and magnetic, was now fraught with a heavy, palpable tension. They navigated the space around each other with the careful, deliberate caution of two people walking through a minefield. The smiles they offered the cameras failed entirely to reach their eyes, masking a profound, shared exhaustion. They were performing the final, grueling act of a fantasy they no longer believed in, honoring a corporate contract while their personal reality lay in ruins. But the most grotesque element of this spectacle was the invisible presence of the third man. While Stewart and Pattinson were contractually marched in front of a global firing squad, forced to commodify their own heartbreak to sell movie tickets, Rupert Sanders was nowhere to be found. The 41-year-old director was granted the absolute luxury of privacy, safely shielded inside his home, completely exempt from the devastating corporate parade that he had caused. The entire event was a masterclass in Hollywood artificiality, a suffocating exercise in maintaining a profitable illusion over a foundation of absolute emotional wreckage, while the true architect of the disaster remained comfortably untouched. In the shadows of this highly publicized corporate obligation, an incredibly human, deeply tragic attempt at reconciliation was quietly taking place. In the autumn following the scandal, paparazzi captured grainy images of Stewart and Pattinson together in the secluded neighborhoods of Los Angeles. They were photographed sitting in the backyard of a rented home, leaning against a concrete wall, talking in hushed tones. They looked stripped of their celebrity, just two exhausted young people trying to navigate an impossible situation. The attempted reunion was rooted in a shared, isolating trauma. Despite the betrayal, the humiliation, and the relentless noise of the outside world, they were the only two people on the planet who truly understood the suffocating reality of the Twilight machine. They had grown up together inside a uniquely terrifying, globally monitored pressure cooker. That shared trauma creates a bond that is incredibly difficult to sever, even in the face of absolute betrayal. For a brief, agonizing period, they tried to rebuild the sanctuary that had been destroyed. They attempted to retreat into the familiarity of their shared history, desperately hoping that the foundation of their connection could withstand the radioactive fallout of the paparazzi photographs. But a relationship cannot heal when it is being actively monitored by an audience of millions, and when a third figure is permanently wedged between them. The ghost of Rupert Sanders and the highly public nature of his transgression was inescapably embedded in their dynamic. Every time Stewart and Pattinson stepped out of their home, they were hunted. The fans who had positioned Pattinson as a tragic martyr were enraged that he would forgive the woman they had decided to crucify. The relentless, suffocating pressure of a world waiting for them to fail, combined with the unerasable shadow of the older director's intrusion, proved to be a weight the young couple simply could not carry. The trust had been fundamentally fractured by the triangle, and the environment they lived in was entirely too toxic to allow for genuine healing. After a few months of a strained, highly guarded attempt at reconciliation, the relationship quietly collapsed. The golden couple was permanently, irreversibly severed. As the personal dust began to settle, the true, deeply systemic cruelty of the Hollywood apparatus was revealed. The professional fallout of the scandal transformed a private tragedy into a chilling indictment of an industry operating on a ruthless, structurally misogynistic double standard. Following the massive financial success of Snow White and the Huntsman, Universal Pictures immediately began developing a highly anticipated sequel. Kristen Stewart was the titular character. She was Snow White, the central axis around which the entire fantasy universe was built. By every conventional rule of franchise filmmaking, her return for the sequel was an absolute, unquestionable certainty. However, the studio executives, analyzing the radioactive nature of her public image following the scandal, made a cold, calculated, and breathtakingly brutal corporate decision. They did not merely delay the sequel or attempt to rehabilitate her image. They effectively erased her from her own franchise. The studio announced that the next installment would entirely pivot away from the character of Snow White. The film was aggressively rebranded as The Huntsman: Winter's War, shifting the narrative focus completely onto her male co-star, Chris Hemsworth. Kristen Stewart, the highest paid actress in the world just a year prior, was unceremoniously dumped from a multi-million-dollar blockbuster property that she had helped build. The message sent by the studio system was deafening in its clarity. Stewart had been deemed tainted goods. The Hollywood machinery, which relies heavily on the perceived purity and likability of its leading ladies, decided that her personal transgression made her an unviable financial investment for a family-friendly fantasy franchise. She was actively punished for her private moral failure, her career derailed, and her earning potential severely slashed. The industry essentially confirmed the verdict of the digital mob. She was a ruined woman, entirely unworthy of the crown she had previously worn. She was exiled into the Hollywood wilderness, forced to navigate a career landscape that had suddenly become hostile and closed off. While Stewart was absorbing the devastating blow of professional exile, the other side of the scandal was playing out in the quiet, sterile environment of a Los Angeles family courthouse. Liberty Ross, the wife of Rupert Sanders, moved with a swift, decisive dignity that stood in sharp contrast to the chaotic circus of the tabloids. She did not engage in public mudslinging. She did not sell her tears to television interviewers or attempt to leverage her heartbreak for celebrity status. Recognizing that the foundation of her marriage had been irreversibly destroyed on the front page of Us Weekly, she quietly filed for divorce in early 2013. The legal documents systematically dismantled a decade-long partnership. The assets were divided. The custody arrangements for their 2 young children were negotiated, and the corporate entity of their marriage was officially dissolved. The collateral damage of Sanders' actions had reached its absolute zenith. He had traded the stability of his family, the privacy of his children, and the trust of his wife for a fleeting, destructive moment of indiscretion. The quiet grace of Liberty Ross only served to highlight the profound, devastating wreckage her husband had left in his wake. Yet, it is the professional trajectory of Rupert Sanders in the aftermath of this wreckage that serves as the ultimate infuriating climax of this entire saga. This is the bitter pill that exposes the terrifying, unyielding hypocrisy of the entertainment industry. While Kristen Stewart was being stripped of her franchise, branded a pariah, and forced into professional exile for a momentary indiscretion, the 41-year-old married director who had abused his position of authority faced absolutely zero institutional pushback. There were no studio press releases announcing his removal from upcoming projects. The Directors Guild did not issue a statement regarding the ethical boundaries between filmmakers and their young cast members. The industry simply looked away, entirely willing to separate the man's moral failures from his his professional competence. In a move that defied all logical metrics of consequence, Rupert Sanders was actually rewarded by the very same studio system that had just punished his younger female counterpart. He was not banished to the world of low-budget independent features. Instead, he was handed the reins to another massive, highly coveted intellectual property. He was hired to direct the live-action adaptation of Ghost in the Shell, a sprawling, visually complex $100 million science fiction epic starring Scarlett Johansson. The sheer audacity of this career progression is staggering. The Hollywood establishment looked at a man whose poor judgment had just detonated one of their most valuable franchises, destroyed a marriage, and caused a global media circus, and decided that he was still entirely trustworthy to manage a 9-figure budget and direct a major global release. He was permitted to fail upward, his career entirely insulated by a deeply entrenched boys' club mentality that actively protects its own. The contrast between the two fates is the definitive, horrifying legacy of the scandal. Kristen Stewart, the young, unmarried woman, was forced to bleed out in the public square, her reputation destroyed, her lucrative franchise violently taken from her, and her personal agony converted into a global spectator sport. Rupert Sanders, the older, married man in a position of power, was granted a quiet divorce, shielded from the venom of the digital mob, and handed the keys to another blockbuster kingdom. This was not a malfunction of the Hollywood system. It was the system working exactly as it was designed to. It was a terrifying, undeniable demonstration that in the architecture of modern celebrity, the rules of consequence are determined entirely by gender and power. A young woman's private life dictates her absolute professional worth, while a man's moral failings are viewed as entirely irrelevant to his artistic genius. The scandal had laid bare the dark, rotting core of the industry, leaving behind a profound sense of injustice as the world watched the Golden Girl pushed into the shadows while the architect of her ruin confidently yelled action on his next $100 million set. The pieces of the Twilight Empire were permanently broken, but the ultimate reckoning for the industry's double standard was still waiting to unfold in the final quiet act of a young woman's fight for her own redemption. The ultimate reckoning of this scandal lies in the wildly divergent paths of the three names permanently bound by that single photograph. Rupert Sanders, the older authority figure, was permitted to fail upward, handed the reins of a $100 million blockbuster, entirely shielded by the industry's patriarchal establishment. Robert Pattinson, suffocated by the toxic public pity and the aggressive constraints of his heartthrob status, quietly retreated from the Hollywood machinery. He sought refuge in the gritty, demanding world of independent cinema, working with auteur directors to completely reinvent his craft and permanently shed the glittering skin of his Twilight past. But the most profound vindication belonged to the woman society threw to the wolves. Exiled from the studio system, Kristen Stewart crossed the Atlantic, retreating into the fiercely protective world of European cinema. In 2015, she became the first American actress in history to win the César Award, France's equivalent of the Oscar. She quietly built an impenetrable fortress of undeniable skill directly over the ashes of her public crucifixion. Looking back, the true legacy of this scandal is a brutal autopsy of our cultural cruelty. It exposed a society that eagerly weaponized a young man's heartbreak, instantly absolved a middle-aged man's infidelity, and ravenously attempted to destroy a 22-year-old woman for shattering an illusion. The ashes of the Twilight Empire remain, serving as a chilling monument to the price a woman pays when she breaks the glass cage of Hollywood's most fiercely guarded fairy tale.